The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody. My name's Paul Magee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we're here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to all Indigenous people who might be here today, whether in the room or online. I'm in the, I always find it strange position of introducing myself. So I'm the author of 3 poetry collections and 2 monographs, the most recent of which is titled Suddenness and the Composition of Poetic Thought. I have many research interests, but the most enduring involve my focus on the history, ethnography, and philosophy of poetic composition. Yep, so that's the title of this talk, and then great. In October 2023, the Australian public voted at a referendum to determine whether the country's constitution should be amended. Were the referendum proposal accepted, a new chapter would be added to that foundational document. That chapter would open as follows, quote, "In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first peoples of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. That body would have the power," the amendment continues, 2, "to make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples." The final element in the new chapter was to state in item 3 that the Australian Parliament shall determine the Voice's composition, function, powers and procedures. The referendum proposal was supported by 60.2% of the Australian population in April 2023, according to a longitudinal poll by Nick Biddle and his colleagues in the ANU's Centre for Social Research and Methods. Come October of that year, the proposal was defeated, receiving only 39.9% support overall. The ANU poll showed that more than 5 times as many Australians changed their vote from yes to no during those 6 months, 22.3%, than changed their vote from no to yes. In short, the no campaign rocketed home. A key archival document from that campaign is your official yes-no referendum pamphlet. The pamphlet was sent out in hard copy to every Australian householder on August the 2nd. Arguments approved by the majority of the parliamentarians voting yes are set out on the left-hand pages under the heading "The Case for Voting Yes." The parliamentarians voting no have set out their arguments on the right under "The Case for Voting No." One of the most surprising aspects of the pamphlet is the prominent role the negative case accords to rhyme. A rhyming phrase appears in bold within the first 4 sentences of the no case, and that same phrase appears in bold 5 pages later as the no case's very final sentence. Why open and close such a consequential document on a rhyme? If you don't know, vote no. The disinformation in the arguments which the pamphlet advanced for the no case was criticised at the time, at least in some media. The broader issue that Australian referendum pamphlets are not fact-checked for all their official appearance, and indeed genesis, is clearly also very concerning and has led to calls for the reform of that whole procedure. These are important issues, but the factuality or otherwise of the no case still leaves unclear why a rhyme, a type of language more typically associated with poetry, would seem such a good way to prosecute it. If you don't know, vote no. Why foreground and bold those words more than any others? A hint towards an answer can be found in the comparative flatness of the counter slogans the Yes campaign came up with over the year and a half leading up to the vote. The premise of if you don't know, vote no was, of course, that the proposed changes were hard to understand. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese attempted to counter this, Biddle et al. Note, quote, by arguing that, quoting Albanese, we are seeking a momentous change, but it is also a very simple one. Others, even more directly, tried to float the counter slogan, if you don't know, find out. And even more clunkily, if you don't know, I challenge you to find out. My point in citing these counter discourses is to highlight the comparative performability and with that memorability of the no cases rhyme. A hint from a rather different direction as to why the no case accorded this rhyming slogan such prominence in their campaigning can be found in Gabriel Appleby and Megan Davis's curt comment, quote, there was also the extremely effective slogan that allowed voters to basically opt out of making a decision. Don't know, vote no. Another way of putting their observation would be that the no cases rhyme offered a way of converting uncertainty into a clear course of action. This paper concerns why public incitements to political and consumer conduct so often take poetic form, and what that can tell us about the art of poetry in turn. The paper will start by reviewing the points of intersection that cognitive psychologists and marketing scholars have elucidated between poetry like prosody and persuasive communication, with key focus on the way processing fluency seems to stand in our minds as a proxy for truthfulness. That's a technical term that I'll come to, processing fluency. Friedrich Nietzsche's thoughts on the power of rhythm to evoke crowd consciousness will enter the picture as well, leading us to explore the relevance of another explanation from social psychology for the power certain communications have upon us, the concept of social proof. An example from an actual poem will be tabled at that point. The paper will conclude by suggesting that one of the key upshots of musically inflected language is that speakers encountering it are primed from the get-go into saying such words, including when saying them in their heads simply so as to read them, as if they actually mean them. As the work of poets like Emily Dickinson make clear, there's no need for us to know what those alliterative, rhyming and otherwise clearly scored words actually mean for a way of saying them with conviction to come to our lips. That is to say, such language furnishes us with the prosody of conviction, even prior to the conviction itself. The overall line of inquiry will thus serve to illuminate some key, but nonetheless rather obscure aspects of how propaganda, promotional discourse, poetry, and even the title of many an academic paper works to insinuate new thinking into our minds. But prior to turning the hints just tabled into arguments as to the power of musical language in effecting mind change, allow me to note just how widespread a phenomenon public poetic persuasion actually is. Many Australians will recall opposition leader and subsequent Prime Minister Tony Abbott's Axe the Tax campaign, which had in its sights the carbon tax initiated in the then ruling Labor Party's 2011 Clean Energy Act. The slogan accompanied the Liberal National Coalition to a landslide victory in 2013. Make America Great Again, used by Donald J. Trump from 2015 to the present, showcases some rather more subtle forms of musicality, such as the almost rhyming relation make bears to great, and the assonance generated by the recurrence of sounds in America and again. Technically, these two features are known as half or slant rhyme and assonance rhyme. To give one further instance of the political deployment of poetic form, consider the March 2026 investigation by The Guardian newspaper that showed that in paid video performances on the Cameo platform, the leader of the UK Reform Party, Nigel Farage, used or alluded to the far-right rhyming slogan, "If in doubt, kick them out," over 20 times since 2021. It's instructive to realise how often successful rhymes have reappeared over the years too, and how often they've switched their political valencies in the process. Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again." Bill Clinton used the phrase in speeches as well. Axe the tax was a motto for anti-GST campaigners in Alberta, Canada, as far back as 1989, and then taken up by British Columbia Conservatives opposing the carbon tax proposed by their Liberal counterparts in 2008, some 5 years prior to Abbott. If you don't know, vote no has made earlier appearances too, including in the referendum pamphlet sent out to all Australian citizens in the run-up to the failed 1999 referendum that would have made Australia a republic. There it took the form "Don't know, vote no." That pamphlet was a veritable songbook of anti-republic rhymes, including "No say, no way," "Keep the status quo, vote no," "When in doubt, throw it out," "No gain, only pain," and the slightly more subtle head-rhyming slogan, "Politician one day, president the next." But Australian use of the "Don't Know" slogan well predates the 1999 Republican referendum. Appearing in the Labor Party campaign against the Conservative Menzies government's 1951 referendum proposal to ban the Australian Communist Party, "If you're in the know, you'll vote no. If you don't know, vote no." And before that, as a slogan against the 1944 referendum to extend wartime controls for a further 5 years. "Play safe. If you don't know, vote no. There's too much at stake to take any risk." What is it about persuasion that experts in the art, which is to say politicians, so often seek to put it in poetic form? I challenge people in the audience to recall the wording of Labor Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's counter to the idea that there was anything complex or hard to understand about the voice proposal, which I cited a mere 900 words ago. Doesn't stick, right? The literal memorability of rhyme and other forms of phonological recurrence is, in contrast, intuitively apparent and has received confirmation in a host of studies in marketing and related fields. For instance, a 2020 Italian study comparing recall of television advertisements played during an episode of David Attenborough's Planet Earth documentary series found that rhyming advertisements for products like Livoni salami and Ponti balsamic sauce received a 21% spontaneous recall rate than unrhyming ads for the very same products. 21% better spontaneous recall rate for the rhyming versions. That same study found that rhyming ads were liked 24% more than unrhyming ones as well. Again, ads for exactly the same product. A 2013 Swedish study of commercial and social advertisements in print, on the other hand, found that rhyming advertisements were not only recalled and liked more than their unrhymed counterparts, they were also perceived as more trustworthy. What is more, that trustworthiness increased the more aesthetically pleasing the rhymes were judged to be. The study's authors follow earlier researchers, McGlone and Tofigbaksh, in labelling this last-named bias, which is to say our, quote, tendency to connect the aesthetic qualities of a message with its truthfulness. They follow these earlier researchers in naming it the Keats heuristic. The allusion is to poet John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, which runs, "When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." As well as taking poor Johnny Keats' name in vain, the authors of the Swedish study refer to the field of fluency research, where findings have shown that when the information at hand gives one a choice between options, quote, the most appealing will often be perceived to be the one which is most fluent and thus easiest to process. Such fluency effects have been empirically associated with a range of phonological features. For instance, difficult to pronounce stock names like you can't even practice this one. Aegiadux Incorporated, or it might be Aegiadux, or it might be Aegiadux. Difficult to pronounce stock names like the aforementioned have been shown to achieve markedly worse results on first release than easily pronounced ones like Barnings Incorporated. Likewise, clarity of font has been shown to have a notable effect on the appeal and what is more trustworthiness of a message. At the same time, fluency research shares a key and disturbing finding with its parent discipline, the study of decision-making in situations of uncertainty and risk. I'm referring to the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman and all that's flowed from it. They got the Nobel Prize for it eventually. I will add, just to preface this, that field has demonstrated that we make a whole series of characteristic shortcuts in our everyday thinking in relation to phenomena like probability and appearance. The field has hypothesised that we do so for speed, on the ground that such heuristic biases tend to be more or less right. Indeed, if we didn't use rules of thumb on a regular basis, we'd be paralysed by the plethora of detail that faces us at every moment. But the fact that we rely on such heuristic biases can also make us easily manipulable. As for that key and disturbing finding I just alluded to, it's that subjects are generally unaware of the influence that heuristic biases, like the Keats heuristic, subjects are generally unaware of the influence that such biases towards particular messaging formats or data patterns are having on their choices, even as they make those choices. That's to say, to return to the musical cases concerning us here, even as alliteration, rhythm, and rhyme amplify the likability, trustworthiness, and truthfulness of the messages they convey, the people processing such messages remain none the wiser as to the extent of these influences. They believe the judgments they make of such musically couched messages are a product of nothing other than their own rational evaluations. In their study of alliteration and promotional pricing messages, e.g., 2 tacos for $2.15, a North American team drew further into the cognitive processes driving such fluency effects. They hypothesised that the sense of fluency associated with forms of phonological repetition, like alliteration and rhyme, is at heart a matter of priming. That's to say, it's a matter of the way exposure to one stimulus increases our cognitive preparedness for related or similar stimuli. They refer in this regard to the established finding that reading a particular word sound increases availability of words sharing that same word sound. Yeah, you hear a word sound, you're going to be much quicker to think of words that share that same sound. It's all cognitive psychology findings. The authors of the study show, accordingly, this study here, 2 tacos for $2.15, they show accordingly that experimental subjects consistently took fewer microseconds to judge whether alliterative strings like 2 tacos, $2.15 represented a good deal or not than they took to judge partially alliterative strings like 2 tacos, $1.85. Non-alliterative strings like 3 tacos, $1.85, were judged with even less rapidity than the partially alliterative ones. These findings serve to demonstrate that hearing one prominent T sound certainly does prime us to process the next one more rapidly than other consonants or vowels. The fluency effect on the actual valency of those judges was found to hold as well, of those judgments was found to hold as well. For the alliterative promotions were consistently judged the better deal. In the taco case, this amounted to a consumer preference for a purchase that was almost 15% higher in price than the partially alliterative ones. Cutting to the chase, we are, after all, reading a study in the Journal of Retailing. The authors conclude that, quote, when offering attractive promotions, managers do not always have to lower prices. Changing the composition of the promotional message alone can improve evaluations and affect choice. The upshot of all these findings is that the potential for public manipulation is amplified when phonologically repetitious phrases like don't know, vote no, and make America great again are in the air. We see a lighter version of this insinuating power in the title of some of the very articles I've been citing, particularly the 2-part ones. So, here we've got alliteration alters. This is the paper that mentions the taco results. So you get the alliterative or rhyming or whatever it is title in the first part of the paper title, and then the supposedly serious part in the second part. Now that's in the social sciences, but here we've got a article in a philosophical mode from a philosophically inclined history journal, and in this case Nietzsche's nursery rhymes. Yeah, beautiful alliterations on the ends, on the R sounds. It's great stuff. And this is really philosophical, they've dispensed with the second part of the title. A bit more social sciences research, McClone and Tawfiq, I mentioned these guys earlier. Birds of a feather flock conjointly. Right. Now, in this case, they're getting the same effect precisely by tripping it up. But note in the second part, and this is a concept they are baptizing this piece, rhyme as reason in aphorisms. And this has been a very successful coinage. One instance of that is the way Philco Kovar and Klempe have it in their very title. And I'd note they're getting some gains from having that in their title as well, because it makes their title more memorable. One might add in passing that one of the many perverse effects of the neoliberalisation besetting higher education in a host of countries since the 1980s has been to exacerbate these attention-getting trends, making scholarship now more musical. But whether we're talking about massively powerful political slogans or the seemingly more trivial issue of presenting one's scholarly findings, it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate what is going on here. We are not talking about mere surface appeal. Or rather, surface appeal is a far more significant phenomenon than we like to admit, reaching deep into our sense of rationality itself. A character in one of Haldor Laxness's novels puts the matter forthrightly. Quote, "A truth that cannot rhyme is no truth at all. The rhyme is a truth in itself, if properly constructed." Rhyme, in the type of context we are considering, amounts to a kind of argument in its own right. Recall, as another way into this, the way a certain stripe of politician will sometimes tauntingly repeat a successful rhyming slogan in response to criticism, as if it were an argument in itself. That is because it actually is a species of argument, as the studies we have canvassed to this point imply. That said, fluency of processing, in its function as a shortcut heuristic for attractiveness, trustworthiness, and truthfulness, is unlikely to be the sole term in the argument a politician like Tony Abbott is thereby making when performing the mini poem in his mouth. The other argument he's most probably conjuring up in responding to criticism with a smug slogan has to do with the way musicality in language evokes a collective presence, intimating that there is something of a crowd on the speaker's side. Just leave you to enjoy that title. The intimation that there's something of a crowd on the sloganist's side is, as far as the words themselves go, chiefly a function of rhythm. Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science, published in 1882, makes this claim. The book comprises a collection of entries on diverse topics, prefaced by a long suite of subversive nursery rhyme-style poems. As for the entries, which are in prose, one is titled The Origin of Poetry. In it, Nietzsche argues that poetry originates in an attempt to capture and wield the persuasive power that rhythm brings to language. Speaking rhythmically allows the speaker, quote, to mould the future in accordance with one's will, whatever that will might be. The reason, Nietzsche advances, is that rhythm, quote, is a compulsion. It engenders an unconquerable urge to yield and join in. Not only our feet follow the beat, but our soul does too. Elsewhere in the book, Nietzsche gives a directly political inflection to the matter. Who, he asks in a short entry entitled On Eloquence, has had the most convincing eloquence so far? The drum roll. And as long as the kings command that, they remain the best orators and rabble-rousers. This curious saying makes most sense. This curious little aphorism of Nietzsche's makes most sense, it seems to me, if we take drum roll metaphorically. This is about the king's power to parcel their speech out in rhythmic and, in fact, quasi-metrical bursts. Think of Jesse Jackson, of Bill Clinton, of Barack Obama. But think too of George W. Bush, who had a real vernacular mastery of speaking in quasi-meter for all his supposed lack of eloquence. You go back and hear George W. Bush speaking, whether it's a rehearsed or an extemporised speech, and it is extraordinary. He's parceling out the words in 3 and 4 beat units. He's delivering a kind of vernacular poem, actually, with often ghastly content, but nonetheless. It's amazing, actually, that the myth of his lack of eloquence, grew up around those performances. Actually, I think we can take Nietzsche's suggestions as to the links between rhythmic language and compulsive collective behaviour much, much further than these initial pointers. But to do so, we need to clear up an issue in the arguments made to this point. What I've said will seem to have leapt wildly between alliteration, assonance, rhythm, and rhyme, treating empirical findings on the effects that alliterative phrases have on decision-making as if they could, for instance, unproblematically illustrate the effects of all these other type of musical phrase, and vice versa. But a rhyme and alliteration equivalent? What, for that matter, of assonance? And how do these three, one might have thought distinct, terms relate to rhythm? At this point, I'll remind the listener of my earlier comment that the sounds threading through make America great again. Those sounds can technically be described as a type of rhyme, assonance rhyme. Even if they don't look like the kind of end-line rhyming we're used to encountering in a relative's self-published book of poems, the alliterations of those M's and R's can also be described as a type of rhyme, alliteration rhyme. The manifestations are different, certainly, but as the fluency research makes clear, all three of these forms of sonic repetition swiftly prime us to expect more of the same sound and to feel a sense of satisfaction on encountering it as well. That's why they can all be called rhymes. So we're collapsing three of our terms into one for the sake of this discussion of the links that Nietzsche makes between rhythmicality and the intimation of a crowd. But what then of the relation between rhyme as an umbrella for all of these forms of phonological recurrence and rhythm? Rhyme in all these versions involves repetition of a given sound, so it might be fine to unite all of them. But rhythm, at least as far as a stress time language like English or like German goes, rhythm involves a repetition of syllabic stress. Actually, the repetition compulsion is even stronger with rhythm, as we all know. So these are not the same things. Rhyme and rhythm are distinct. But nor, and this is the key point, are they separable. The reason if you do not know, vote no, feels so comparatively clunky and has never in fact been a slogan, though it still apparently rhymes, is that the clear stress on do, followed by an offbeat on not, puts a pressure on no to take a strong stress as well. And that in turn stops vote no from replicating the contour of the immediately preceding phrase, thereby sapping the rhyme of much of its propulsion. Note conversely the rhythmic way beat and offbeat alternate through the mugger slogan, and with it the fact that both A sounds are among the four sounds taking the beat. Make America great again. While the three sounds, being unstressed, all fall on the offbeat. It's a pretty masterly little bit of prosodic evil, that, those four words. Similar analyses could be made of all the political and commercial phrases considered to this point. They only really work when embedded in a driving rhythm. You could say the same of Dunkin' Donuts, American Airlines, Bed, Bath and Beyond, to cite some of Davis et al.'s examples of powerfully alliterative brands. They mention Coca-Cola as well. Again, it's not just alliterative, it's actually a very rhythmic little unit. In sum, all of the slogans, advertisements and lines of poetry investigated to this point are united in comprising instances of highly rhythmic language. Having established that his observations actually concern almost all the materials tabled so far, we're ready to return to Nietzsche's claims about the rabble-rousers and their use of rhythm. What those claims bring to the table is a whole other explanation, as far as musicality and language is concerned, for the chief finding of fluency research, viz. That subjects have a tendency to conflate fluency with perceived accuracy. In addition to the heuristic value subjects place on musically induced ease of processing as a kind of shorthand for likability, trustworthiness, and truthfulness, there is also the way that the rhythmic component of such language lulls us into feeling that it is coming from something like a group of us. A politician might feel smug when uttering it because it carries the generally unobserved and thereby all the more powerful connotation that others are saying it too. Recall how we heard Nietzsche state in the passage cited above that rhythmic language is a compulsion. It engenders an unconquerable urge to yield and join in, einzustimmen. Not only our feet follow the beat, but the soul does too. Translator Walter Kaufmann captures the connotations of Nietzsche's German word einzustimmen very well here, in his choice of the English phrasal verb join in. So einstimmen is the word you use in idioms like in den Gesang mit einstimmen, or in die Berufe einstimmen, in den Chor einstimmen, which is to say to join in the singing, to join in the booing, to join in the chorus. Nietzsche's word choice implies that rhythm is not experienced as simple compulsion, but rather as a compulsion of a very specific type, the compulsion to join in with the others and sing along. That same ideologically inflected drum beat is pulsing through all of us. That's the suggestion, I think, really, that we can read into Nietzsche's contention. Poetry scholars have long been aware of these collectivizing effects as well. A driving rhythm serves to turn the lyric I into something rather more like a lyric we. Note accordingly how celebrated prosodist Derek Attridge qualifies his observation in Poetic Rhythm and Introduction that poetic rhythms can serve to represent the contours of the individual spoken voice. We might gloss that initial claim by saying that poetic rhythm can have that intensely intimate effect. It seems to represent a real speaking voice. We can gloss that by saying it can have that intimate effect because its driving beat has a predictive force, clarifying from the get-go for the reader just how to say the words as the poet intended us to hear them. Yeah, it really scores the words on the page in a way that your reception of them, which would be your subvocalization of them as you're reading, is very clear because that beat tells you exactly, where to hit the stressed syllables. So you can read a poem from, the 17th century like Spenser's Fairy Queen, and you can read it effortlessly after a few pages. Whereas if you try to read some 17th century philosophy in English, it is so, so, so difficult. Yeah. And we're much better off reading translations in a way. Whereas you can read Spenser and it will get in because the beat scores the words for fluency of processing, even if you don't understand what they mean, which is a regular effect. And also a regular effect is that doesn't really matter. And another point to this effect is that there's really no garden path sentences in verse. It happens in prose all the time because we don't know where the writer intends us to stress the syllables. We don't understand their emphatic stress, all of those things we've got to imagine and project onto the page. Poetry makes all that clear. You don't get lost in the syntax. To the contrary, once we've gotten in sync with the rhythm, particularly when the verse is metrical, it feels like a voice is speaking to us right from the page. So this is more or less what Attridge is getting at in saying that poetry, lyric, can serve to represent the individual speaking voice. Attridge's comment on lyric's power to evoke the individual utterance alludes to this very attribute, a feature, as we've seen, of poetry's fluency. But what I want to focus on here is the way Attridge immediately qualifies that observation. On lyric's capacity to sound like a genuine living voice, he immediately qualifies it with the assertion that something in those same driving rhythms tends beyond the individual. Quoting Attridge, when language, usually assumed to be the product of a single individual and a single mind, takes on the garb of some conventional order, such as figures of rhetoric or oral formulae, it becomes to that extent trans-individual. The rhythmic forms of poetry, especially metrical poetry, furnish utterances with a public quality, even when they seem most personal and intimate. To test the relevance of this observation on the political materials with which we opened, consider the public collectivist feel of if you don't know, vote no. An interesting effect of the rhythmically flat version of that same slogan, if you do not know, vote no, an interesting effect of it is that it feels far less like the voice of a crowd. It feels much more like a statement of some other ordinary fallible person. And yet, and this is the real twist, much like the lyric with its concurrent and immediate intimation of a living spoken voice, that don't know, vote no slogan has the capacity to insinuate itself into the uncertain voters' thoughts as something they might well say to themselves there where their uncertainty lies, there with the voice that speaks inside their own heads as they read that news post or bumper bar sticker or passing billboard. In sum, Nietzsche's and now Attridge's observations provide us with a second way to understand the links we've started to uncover between musically shaped language and truth effects. Words in such form come to us with huge fluency. We might even say that they come to us with the fluent immediacy of the thoughts that pop into our heads. But even as they do so, they evince something of the speech of the group all around us. And actually, we can take this analysis even further. We can do so by allying Nietzsche and Attridge's observations to a sharply defined concept from social psychology. Coming as they seem to from a crowd, what further charges us to overestimate the likability, trustworthiness, and truthfulness of rhythmic messages like slogans and jingles is the way they elicit another key heuristic bias from us. I'm referring to the phenomenon of social proof. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini, who coined the term, defines social proof as follows. The greater number of people who find any idea correct, the more a given individual will perceive the idea to be correct. Cialdini mentions the 900-strong queue to drink the Kool-Aid at Jonestown in 1977 as a case in point. Bibb and Latané's much-cited demonstration that the more bystanders who are present while a crime is being committed, the fewer of them are likely to help the victim, is yet another shocking instance of this tendency to lock one's rationality in step with the crowd. One's rationality and also one's moral agency. The other thing experiments in this tradition have shown is that such effects are amplified whenever subjects feel uncertainty as to what is actually going on. You know, are those people on the other side of the street really hitting each other, or maybe they're just playing around? Nobody else seems to be noticed. You know, I'm going to walk on. There are many, many disturbing examples of how social proof deforms us as moral beings. But one could also point to the more innocent fact that bartenders will regularly put some of their own money in the tip jar at the start of the night, and so too church officials when they're handing round the plate. For Cialdini, the research showing that canned laughter actually does make audiences laugh longer and find jokes funnier is one further, if uncanny, demonstration that even the most artificial of indications that others view a phenomenon a particular way can predispose us to align our judgments to theirs. So what I'm suggesting then is that the rhythmic utterances we've been considering, which is pretty much everything we've looked at so far, they have an element of canned laughter about them. And that this is an at least partial explanation of the insinuating powers we've tracked to this point. The strange sense of likability, trustworthiness, and truthfulness attaching to messages involving rhythm and rhyme in all their forms. Axe the tax might start to sound like the thing we all want to happen. After all, isn't the science still in doubt? If you don't know, vote no. To conclude, Emily Dickinson's verse will seem worlds away from such gross public manipulations. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. It's hard to see any party political demagoguery or commercial advantage here in what might variously be read as either a description of enlightenment or the onset of insanity. But for all their wildness, there's something very social and even sociable about these lines as well. For a start, they're couched in the very same metrical form as ballads, nursery rhymes, hymns, limericks, and even rap. An initial 4-beat line is followed by a 3-beat one, and that figure's repeated over the second part of the quatrain to give what can be technically represented as a 4-3-4-3 metrical structure. As when occurring in the conventional forms just named, Dickinson's 2 3-beat lines and Mourner's to and fro that sense was breaking through, both of these lines end with a palpable pause, which is technically called a virtual beat. They can just as well be described as 4-beat lines for this reason, underlining that the whole quatrain is really a species of song. But however one classifies it, the point is that we feel powerfully in the sway of a collective form of utterance as we read these 4 lines. Let's bring to the table the idea that we all have a bias towards fluency of expression, along with the concept of social proof and the heuristic bias that entails, which I'm suggesting pertains to rhythmicality in language. And with those 2 concepts, let's bring back all we've discussed about the truth-making powers of alliterative rhymes, like I felt a funeral, alliterating on the Fs, also known as head rhyme. The counterintuitive suggestion I'm trying to make here is that whatever experience these lines happen to give us of the phenomenon of sense breaking through, that experience will be closely allied to the feelings of liking, trustworthiness, and truthfulness that pertains to a slogan in rhythmic form, or perhaps even more pertinently, to a collective song at a funeral or a wake. It's important to add that the strangeness and idiosyncrasy of Dickinson's language does not really seem to cancel these group effects out. And why should it? Language is full of strange, collectively accreted phrases, and nowhere more so than in ritualistic settings. What of bizarre sayings like, your memory lives on in us? For me, it calls to mind Ludwig Wittgenstein's curt observation in relation to the suggestion that we should try to see something from the other person's point of view. Quote, I can't stick my head in his. What if that other funeral favourite, love beyond words, missed beyond measure? What would constitute a measure of missing? As for the words Auld Lang Syne that we sing with such emotion at wakes, on New Year's and at other farewells, just what does that phrase mean again? One thing it clearly means is we are in company, even when singing alone. Dickinson's words glimmer with a kind of almost understanding that Aristotle and numerous others since him have celebrated as a precursor to learning and even science. But there is also, and this is a point more consonant with Plato's critical thinking, the influence of musical form in deluding us into thinking on quite the wrong grounds that some truth must surely lie there. After all, the poem's in 4-3, 4-3. It alliterates, it rhymes. Then space began to toll, we read at the end of the 3rd stanza, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing. Then again, we find the extreme idiosyncrasy of Dickinson's thought receiving the strangely convincing support of the collective musical forms, alliteration, rhythm, endline rhyme, assonance, but above all, rhythm, in which they are couched. However strange, her words have the truth effect of their own fluency and the social proof of the rhythms pulsing through them to support whatever meanings we will come to find there. And what meanings we will find there. So poetic language makes its insinuating ways into our thoughts. Usually at this point, I would leap onto the stage and Thanks, Speaker. Look, I'd love your thoughts on this. I'm intending this as the start of a new book project, so I'd really appreciate any ideas, on where it's going, where it might go. And I'm going to move to the front just so I can hear better.
Boom, then, Paul. Thank you. I love that. It took me back to the 90s. And Anthony Easthope's book, Poetry as Discourse, where he talks about similar kind of things, especially to do with rhythm. But I was particularly interested in your work, in your talking about rhyme, because these are mostly for fairly conservative or very reactionary parties. I mean, as early as I Like Ike, for instance.
Yeah.
And there does seem to me, you mentioned nursery rhyme, the nursery rhyme flavor. There seems to be a diminishing of the audience, making it easy. Remember the Chaser Boys mocking Kevin Rudd's prolixity? I think they said...
Oh, sorry, Jen, can you just say that bit again? I didn't hear it.
But the nursery rhyme style of these political slogans, diminishing the capacity of the audience. And I was thinking there of how the Chaser Boys mocked Kevin Rudd and his prolixity. I think it went something like, what do we want? Enhanced programmatic specificity. When do we want it? In due course, And that was hilarious. But it also isn't just, if you don't know, say no. And what this brings me to is Canberra and going away from some of the other kinds of stories you told. Canberra voted in favour of the Republic. Canberra voted in favour of the voice to Parliament. Canberra usually votes a safe Labour kind of an approach. So they don't seem to be paying attention. Is this, I wonder, because we are, on the whole, considerably more educated than much of the country? Or is it because we think the rest of the country hates us and so we don't follow the lead?
Well, yeah, you see, Jen, we think that we need to get educated to be able to appreciate poetry, but actually you need to be educated to have a resistance to poetry. I mean, again, this, like when I got to the last page of this paper, I found myself realizing that this is a Platonic argument that I'm making. Not many people in poetics have been fans of Plato's comments on poetry, which are basically that it should be dismissed from the Republic. So it is disturbing, to find yourself in that position. But then again, maybe we've been too blithe in our thinking of what Plato was really getting at in those passages in the Republic where he dismisses poets. Possibly what we're dealing with in this art form is far more powerful and potentially dangerous than it tends to be given social credit for. And I would say too, with regard to our beloved national capital here, I used to live in the Soviet Union, as in I lived in Moscow under the Soviet Union. And it took me a few years to realize that this is a kind of homecoming with the lack of billboards, with the lack of central gathering places. This is the kind of city that in many ways is designed to create a dispassionate form of civic engagement that's far more heady. Pretty hard to have a protest here. You got to walk a long way. Mike first, Diane.
Thanks, Paul. It's always wonderful to hear you draw multiple disciplines into the one talk, and I just feel like I want to hear it again and again. It's just wonderful. But it just brings to mind this whole concept of this taxonomy you're setting up, like a trivium and rhetoric, and that whole concept of how we understand poetics and how we understand learning. Where do we place things like free verse? Where do we put E. E. Cummins, and where do we put Walt Whitman, who don't use any of these techniques, and yet we instantly understand them?
Well, look, Mike, I guess I would disagree with the premise. I think they use all of these techniques. Yeah, I think free verse is actually a form of multimeter. Like it is just continually slipping in and out of the kind of rhythmic expectations that a 3-beat or a 4-beat or a 5-beat line generates. And even longer lines will tend to disaggregate into smaller metrical units. And I think the other thing about this is that rhythmic expectations build up with incredible rapidity. I mean, I think that fluency research demonstrates as much, already over 3 iterations of a T sound, and you're judging, the phenomena it's representing so much faster than without that. So I would say that free verse, but I'd also say everyday conversation even is far more poetic than we tend to give credit for. I think the the way prose has come to dominate our understanding of not just artistic, but also intellectual communication, has kind of led to a few blindnesses on this score. Like, we imagine people speak in prose, and they just don't. They speak in something much more like George W. Bush, like these quasi-metrical song forms, really. So yeah, that'd be my response. Whitman is just mesmeric. Wow. Frank.
Great, thanks, Paul. It was a fascinating paper. I kept thinking of John Howard. We will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come, which is, I think, fairly superbly rhythmic and has been mesmerising clearly for subsequent conservatives and so on. The question I wanted to ask really was about the place of poetry in public discourse. So, in the field I work in history, that there's often this idea that a poetry once had a more prominent place in public discourse. Go back to a speech by Alfred Deakin or something, 120 years ago, and they'll routinely quote poetry as a part of a set piece speech, which made the whole Peter Malinowskis quoting of Henry Lawson poem in his victory speech in the recent South Australian election sort of a bit. It felt out of its time in that sense. But I wonder if what you're saying here is actually poetry never went away. It's really just we need to look for it in a different kind of way to someone like me working on the 1890s and finding it everywhere in public discourse.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. My political education came from midnight oil concerts. And if we regard popular music as, the lyric form, really, with just a few more musical lines to it, then it's one of the most prevalent kind of certainly entertainment forms, of our day. And also it totally gets in the younger generation. And one of the things you see, one of the delights of teaching poetry is to realise that a lot of people are activated towards it through popular music. And will come, particularly with rap in recent decades, they'll turn up with that as the thing that has turned them on to it. But yeah, I don't think it's gone away at all. I think our capacity to recognise it has diminished. That's what I'd say. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Too many streams there to unpack. So certainly I started off by thinking these slogans and street marches and the importance there. And we see them all the time. If you read the banners, it's like, if you don't know, vote no, but it'll be the equivalent. But it draws people in and it gets them marching. But my main question is to do with other languages. So do you see similar things, say, in Mandarin or, some of the Eastern European languages? You've been to Russia. Would you have a similar sort of simplicity in Russian? Perhaps you would, but certainly in the Romantic languages you do. But if you go to a totally different language structure, do you think you'd find it?
Every language has a different form of musicality to it, and even a different way of parceling out rhythm. We have to speak rhythmically because of the way our muscles contract and expand as we're moving. It makes it possible to do so without pain. It's like walking rhythmically, or soaring rhythmically or something like that. But those rhythms are parceled out in different ways. And like in English and German and Russian and Spanish, it's through the stressed syllable. So we're stressing, roughly every second syllable and leaving the other one unstressed. Or maybe we're unstressing two syllables, in which case we speed up, and you get a double offbeat. So that's certainly those stress-timed languages as they get called. But a language like French, for instance, is, it doesn't alternate in that way, nor does Japanese. And consequently, the poetry works differently. The rhythms of it work differently. Like you go to ancient Greek and Latin, and the rhythms would doled out in patterns of long and short vowel, you know, not stressed syllable. So it really does differ. I wish I knew more about how rhythm is done in other
Particularly in
languages.
terms of the contemporary issues and the way language is used politically.
Look, I'll put it this way, Diane. I've got a piece that's about to be published where I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about political speech and its tendency towards aesthetic linguistic forms like these. And one of the things I postulate in that paper is that the people with real mastery of political speech, the sort of speech that whips crowds up, you know, I'd put Pauline Hanson among them. I think she's an extraordinary orator, execrable human being, but has incredible rhetorical power. You know, and what I think is that people like that, their utterance tends to be untranslatable, as in it loses most of its demagogic effect when you translate it. Somehow what they're working with is something very local to the vernacular. You know, it's partially the soundscape and the musicality, but there's something more going on there. And we have this, you know, traditional kind of aphorism that poetry is what cannot be translated. And I'm tempted to say in that piece that that this kind of language also can't be translated on some level, or part of its power, a key part of its power is there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, sorry. Hi, Paul. Fantastic, super paper. Can I just ask, so are you said kind of a question, I'm not sure it's a question. Does some of what you're saying help name why translation and cross-cultural literary encounter not just technical problems, but ontological ones? Is that what you're saying? Especially with Wittgenstein in mind as well, you mentioned him as well.
Oh, that gets into really interesting territory, I think. You know, the way I would respond to that is that Wittgenstein uses commas really deliberately, and he himself comments on this, and he talks about the way he more or less stages the reading experience for the reader. You know, he wants to affect the prosody of the way the reader is reading him, because where they put the pauses and things will really have an impact on the capacity of his thought to work in their heads in a kooky kind of way. Yeah, and the more you think in these terms, the more you start to see the kind of I guess you'd call it the rhetorical side that is innate to philosophical work.
Yeah.
But I don't like the word rhetorical in the sense that it seems to indicate that that's different to what anyone else is doing. Like if I look at the English, you know, the kind of canonical English philosophical tradition, what comes through so many of those writers we set on the great books courses and read again and again is just how strongly a voice comes through in their writing and how much they get you taking in what they're writing in a really oral kind of level. You know, Hume is an example, but also you could go to Spinoza, you could go, you know, Heidegger. They're all totally idiosyncratic prose stylists who manage to get the feel of the voice in the room as you're reading them. Translatable, oh man, you know, and that'd be my response. I think
I was just thinking more like Wittgenstein says, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him.
Yeah.
I'll leave that with you.
Well, you know, but the rejoinder to that is, well, actually, we probably could, because the sort of things that one speaks about are relatively limited. And the reason there is translatability and something like universality in human communication is because there is such a commonality of needs caused by, you know, biological apparatus. Like societies can only take so many shapes. and so on. So I reckon we could chat with that lion, you know.
Paul, yeah, hi. I thought that was brilliant. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Is the paper available?
I'm sorry?
Is the paper available?
Well, I want to, yeah, I want to send it off, but I've got to think of where to place it. And
Yeah.
that I'm not sure of.
No problem. Look, what struck me is that everything you said made sense. I agree with it, but it seemed to me, in my mind, I'm generalizing it to a sort of affective aesthetic, right? Because I see this in the visual. I'll give you an example. If you look at Nigel Farage's face, which is something I don't like to do very often, but you compare him, for example, with the face of a comedian back in the 1920s in the US, Joe E. Brown, they're virtually identical. And it's interesting to me why I see that, what aspects of that face repeat in some sense that give me some sort of emotional response to it. And I mean, if you take what Farage says, I mean, he's monstrous in his what he says, but in his face, it's different. So what I'm getting at is a wider aesthetic to rhythm. Now, you come to music as well. I mean, for goodness sake, you mentioned it yourself, the whole rap. This is rhyme. In terms of, I'm thinking it's time, you know, and that Trump is essentially a stand-up. So there's a big relationship between the power and the rhythm of stand-up comedy and poetry, as you describe it. Do you agree it's a wider exercise?
Yeah, look, thank you, Mick. The way I would respond to that, it's possibly at a tangent, but it has to do with well, actually, Walter Benjamin's observation that fascism aestheticizes politics. You know, much of this research comes out of an attempt to engage with that thesis that is just so productive, but also, you know, what quite does it mean? One of the, one way we can interpret that is that it floods our minds with fiction or something like that. But I'm suspecting more and more that fascist politics gets us judging the politician as a performer in much the same way we judge an artist. Sure. As a performer, where you know, we're going, oh wow, that was so beautifully executed. You know, sure, it's fiction. I mean, I know it's a fictional world, whatever, but what a performance, you know, or didn't you give it to the man? Like, wow, you know, and I suspect that there's something in that where we're making a separation between the performance and the performer. Yeah. And you know, I'm kind of leaping, I guess, from your association between the Farage face and that comedian.
Yeah.
You know, because when you're laughing with the comedian, yeah, you're laughing at their joke, but also another part of you is kind of assessing the performance and enjoying the fact that you think it's been so well done.
But we also like the face. The face is somehow very attractive to us. It's not an ugly face. It has a different emotional rapport with a lot of people. You know, I could go on about, you know, Dutton and
yeah,
exactly as the opposite.
Yeah. And look, I'm just not sure.
Yeah,
you know, with those things, don't know.
There's also a question online.
Oh, okay. Would you be able to read it out, John? Is that okay?
Jeanette Hunter online is saying, thanks for living in Newcastle, getting involved in environmental activism here. Was thinking about what you've said in relation to a lot of chants I've been learning lately for protests. Coal, don't dig it, leave it in the ground, it's time to get with it. All I can think of now. Wondered about other examples of rhythmic language for protest.
Yeah, look, I'm glad to hear those rhymes because I just in the last, you know, few decades, I keep hearing hey, hey, ho, ho, blah, blah, blah has got to go, which you know, I think we can improve on that one. I mean, look, it serves this, you know, very, what's the word, schematic requirement. You know, it is funny just how far you can get away with nonsense if it's musical. Russell and I read Finnegan's Wake together, and we're just constantly encountering the effect of an utterance you don't understand, but you know exactly how to read it and how to perform it. You know, and obla-di, obla-da is like one of the great lines of poetry. Terrible, meaningless. You know, I'm sorry, I'm ranting. I think, but you know, it might be something too that in our activism we pay a bit more attention to. Like, and obviously, if you come up with a really no, let me say that again. It's very hard to write a good political poem. It is one of the hardest genres to write because your desire to be seen as a particular person just often will beat through the surface of the poem to be seen as a good person rather than a bad person, for instance. And so the poetry just loses the kind of sophistication and risk that we need. And I imagine we're going to have the same problem writing good slogans, you know. Very difficult thing to do, but let's do it. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, Paul,
maybe Russell, and then we can go back to Alex.
When you were talking about slogans and politicians, I was thinking about whether certain politicians have a disadvantage because of the prosody of their name. Like Kevin Rudd is not particularly musical. And then I thought, what about politicians whose names are hard to spell or pronounce? And I could not get out of my head Anastasia Palaszczuk, which is a very prosodically fortunate name, and seems, you know, she could probably attribute some of her success to that musicality. Nobody could spell it, but they could say it, right? So it's yeah.
And is this the same politician who was referred to as Red Anna? Is that
no? That was somebody else in a
no, I'm thinking of another Queensland
yeah, it was a minister for
premier who got called that. Yeah,
just I couldn't get that name out of my head, so I said everybody else.
That's because we get very proud. We finally learned how to say it, so we say it all the time. And now she's gone. It's really frustrating. Look,
lovely name. Yeah.
I've talked about political slogans. I don't know whether you can talk about this or not. Is about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is very powerful.
Yeah.
And you can't say it in Queensland. I suppose my question is it's got political content, it's got the rhythm, it's got power behind it. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you raised that. Partially to have the words in the room. But say at the folk festival the other week, so my partner's Palestinian, Ilona, you know, and we went to, I think, all of the performances of the Palestinian group that was there, Tabriz. And we also went to this wonderful discussion that they put on where the musicians were there on stage and they were talking about their story and then talking about what music means to them. And most of these people have just come from Gaza, where their houses have been destroyed.
Yeah, yes.
And they were talking about the way music provides a way of carrying a nation and carrying a people. And obviously it was incredibly powerful.
Yes.
But I think also, you know, I do link it with what I was trying to say in this paper about the way rhythm brings this intimation of a crowd, you know, and I think it's song as well. And it can have this really profound function of allowing people to carry on with a sense of their society being there, particularly when they're singing in their language.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that'd be my
response. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
That might be time to call a day.